Hey church, the recommended book for this month is a book by Colin Marshall and Tony Payne called The Trellis and the Vine. And on the side of my own house, I have a vine here, as you see, growing up on this trellis. And in this book, the authors use this idea of a vine and a trellis as an illustration for thinking about the church and its ministry. You see, we have a tendency, as this book argues, and I think is the case, we have a tendency, especially in the American and modern church, to really focus in on our programs and our institution as a church. All the things that make the church be able to run in its operations. And those things are important, those things are oftentimes needed, but they're not the ultimate aim of the mission. You see, the mission that Jesus gave us was to make disciples of him. Go and make disciples of all nations. And so in this book, the authors use this idea of a vine and the trellis as an illustration to say that the church is like the vine itself. We want to see the vine grow. We want to see the plant grow. The people, in other words, that's our focus. That's the plant itself. And the trellis, although it is needed, it helps sustain the growth of the vine, that the people are growing through some of the programs and institutions and the structure of the church. At the end of the day, if we had a really well-maintained trellis, but there was no vine growing on it, who cares? And so that's a helpful illustration for thinking about our own priorities as a church. This book is a book that I would say is one of my absolute favorites. It's so helpful in thinking about how we do church, and not just for, you might think, well, that's good for a pastor to know or a church leader to know, but honestly, this book, it would be super helpful for anybody who is participating in a church, any church member, to read and absorb its content, to really all help us get on the same page for what we do and why we do what we do as a church and what our convictions are. This book maps onto our own convictions at Crossway really well. We say in our philosophy ministry, for example, that one of our principles, one of our core convictions is that we want to prize what's called every member ministry. So it's not just, in other words, the pastors that are doing the ministry, the ones tasked with doing the ministry, but the pastors are uniquely a role of mobilizers to equip everybody else to be engaged in ministry, coming out of Ephesians 4. Or we also say that our focus as a church, as we say in our philosophy ministry, is people, not programs. Just like this book says, the trellis work, the program, the institutions, the finances, the meetings, the different ministries, those are all can be helpful, but they're not the point. And sometimes we can get overly obsessed with those things, and our mission can end up getting distracted to being obsessed with the trellis when our focus should really be the vine and the trellis, in as much as it actually serves vine work, in as much as it actually serves making disciples. So let me read a section from this book that summarizes this well, and you can kind of get a taste. They say at the end of their first chapter, to be a disciple is to be called to make new disciples. Of course, Christians will receive and exercise differing gifts and ministries, but because all are disciples of Christ, all of us are disciple makers. Thus, the goal of Christian ministry is quite simple and, in a sense, measurable. Are we as a church making and maturing, nurturing genuine disciples of Christ? The church always tends towards institutionalism and secularization. The focus shifts from preserving traditional programs and structures, the trellis, and the goal of discipleship is actually lost. The mandate of disciple making provides the touchstone, though, for whether our church is engaging in Christ's actual mission. Are we making genuine disciples of Jesus Christ? Our goal is not to make members of our institution, but genuine members of Christ. So church, let's be about the vine work and see the trellis work in our own church as supporting that. Again, I highly encourage this book. This is one of my absolute favorite books. It was super helpful for me. I felt like it just tapped into my own heartbeat for church and reflects a biblical vision for how we do church. So I highly recommend you picking this book up. It's only, about a little bit less than 200 pages, so it's pretty accessible as well.